Now we come to look at some issues associated with our dimensional energy grids. The 12 dimensional energies in our local universe associated with matter fields are symbolized by the Katara grid. The Katara grid with its 12 centers is effectively a map of dimensional structure within our local universe, and it represents the lower 12 dimensions associated with the matter fields. And as we've already discussed, there are key connection points in this Katara grid. The center point, referred to as the Azure A, is a key connection point, and this is what the Katara grid, the grid structure, merges through and through which it returns. There's another key connection point up at dimension 12. This is where we connect with the still higher dimensional levels associated with the light fields and higher levels in creation associated with the sound and the pure life fields, pure consciousness fields. It also connects with other levels in cosmic structure. In other words, we've seen in the God world structure that there are more complex structures of these Katara grids that form cosmic structures. And these structures, the 12 center is a key connection point with higher levels in these structures. Now, in many mystical systems, there's another grid structure referred to as a Tree of Life grid. There's a lot of mysticism associated with this structure, but again, it has fundamental application as a map of dimensional structure, and that's where it finds practical use. Now, when we compare the two structures, there are remarkable similarities between them. They're fundamentally similar in structure and arrangement. However, there are key differences. Now, the differences between the two are highly significant, and there are major applications and consequences associated with them. So I'll spend a little bit of time exploring these. To enumerate the differences, first of all, the dimension 12 is missing in the Tree of Life grid. That's a key connection point to higher levels in cosmic structure and to higher frequency levels in dimensional structure. That's missing in the Tree of Life grid. Secondly, the Azure A point, which is a key connection point in the 12-dimensional structure and in the Katara grid, that's also missing in the Tree of Life grid. It's not represented. What we do have represented instead is that the center corresponding to dimension 5, which is referred to as Tiferet in the Tree of Life grid structure, that has become a center within the Tree of Life grid. In other words, that is referred to as a sun center, around which all the other centers are organized as planets, as if they are orbiting that particular sun center. They all hold connection to that sun center. So that has become a alternative connection point, center point within the Tree of Life grid. Furthermore, there's another enigmatic center in the Tree of Life grid referred to as the Date center, and this corresponds to dimension 8. This center is referred to as a stealth hidden central sun, and it's not used in a lot of the more outward-looking mystical systems associated with the Tree of Life. In other words, most of the systems associated with the Tree of Life ignore this center, and they only deal with the remaining 10 centers centered around Tiferet, the center 6, what is 6 in that numerical system. This Date center, knowledge of it is reserved to deeper levels in the mystical structures and systems. So it isn't an enigmatic center, but nonetheless it's an important center. It's an 11th center that provides a significant connection point into the Tree of Life grid. Furthermore, the numbering of the dimensions is changed from the Katara grid. The Katara grid numbers dimensions from the bottom up. This numbers dimensional levels from the top down. So the Earth here is at the bottom, at level 10 in the grid. Now, another point to note is that the spring system is inverted, so that what corresponds to dimension 5 actually is now numbered 6. It has taken on the numbering of 6. So this 6th center, representing the center of the grid and the sun center for the grid structure, the relationship between the Earth and this sun center is mediated in this grid by the Moon, Mercury and Venus. In other words, Earth doesn't have a direct connection to the Sun in this particular system. In other words, the planets are associated with the centers in the Tree of Life grid. In the configuration of the planetary alignments can vary a bit, but this is a typical representation of the planetary alignments associated with the Tree of Life grid. So the Earth-Sun relationship it's not a direct relationship, it's mediated through the Moon and facilitated by Mercury and Venus, which are the two planets between the Earth and the Sun. Now in the Katara grid, the corresponding planetary alignments have the Earth associated with 3 and the Sun with associated 4, and there is direct connection between them. Furthermore, the proportions of the Tree of Life grid are altered. The overall proportions, the outline proportions of the Katara grid are height to width 1. In other words, the height to width ratio is 2 to 1. It's different in the Tree of Life grid. The proportioning of the Tree of Life grid is determined by a separate structure referred to as the Flower of Life structure, on which is normally overlaid. How did these differences arise? Therein lies a major story which has significant implications and consequences. And we'll look at some of these in the next slide. Here we have our Katara grid as before, with its 12 centers and the crystal spiral emerging from its core center, traveling out through the grid to the center 12, both of which are key connection points. Now, moving away from the geometries and the technicalities of the grid, we have to look at a bit of history here. The history of our local universal structure goes back a long, long ways. We're at the end of a long period of history within this local 12-dimensional universe. Everything very well. Creation, life came in, consciousness projected in and projected as life into the different levels in this universal structure, experienced creation within the structure, and then it went back out again, and everything was fine for a long period of time. However, problems did arise. There was a group of higher dimensional beings in dimension 11 referred to as the Elohim, and another group referred to as the Seraphim in dimension 10. Now, a faction of the Elohim came in conflict with a faction of the Seraphim. Now, when we come into creation, when we project into creation, we are free to explore it subject to the law of consequence. So there is a significant element of free will and a significant element of allowance for things to be explored. Now, one of the things that did come up and was being explored was the whole issue of aggression. This became up as a theme to be explored, and it's okay to explore it, but to resolve it and bring it back into wholeness with higher levels of creation. However, what happened was that while aggression was being explored, it began to wind back on itself. So instead of resolving, this aggression started to recycle back on itself into ever greater degrees of concentration and ever greater degrees of distortion, degenerating into violence. Now, it wasn't the full group of the Elohim were not involved, it was just a faction within the Elohim coming in conflict with a faction within the Seraphim, and these factions were referred to as the Anu factions within each of these higher dimensional families of consciousness. Now, the group in dimension 11 decided that the group they were fighting with in dimension 10 were the cause of all the problems that were arising and that they were experiencing. So it decided that a way to deal with the problem was to eliminate the group in dimension 10 that were opposing. So they sought permission from higher dimensional levels, from the higher levels of consciousness, to eliminate this group. They were refused that permission. They were effectively told to work things out, and to sort out their problems and to solve their issues. So this group of Anu Elohim decided to take the law into their own hands. They decided to cut off any interference from the higher dimensional levels, from their parent families of consciousness in higher dimensional levels, and to take the law into their own hands and to sort out this problem. They were also blaming creation, the laws of creation. They were saying that they were flawed, that such a situation did arise, and they were going to fix all these problems. So they decided to take the law into their own hands. They came up with a scheme to take control of the dimensional universe below them. Looking down into creation, there were some key centers they could work with, in particular dimensional center 8. Now, within the complete 15-dimensional structure, which includes 12 dimensions of the matter fields plus the 3 dimensions of the light field, we have 15 dimensions there. Now, the center point of that 15-dimensional structure is center 8. So center 8 is a significant connection point with other levels in creation. So that's a fairly powerful center. It is symmetrically arranged, or has association with another center, center 5, which is just below the Azure center of the grid itself. So these two centers are symmetrically arranged around the center of the grid, and they share a certain degree of connection. So these were two centers they could work with. They couldn't work with 12 because that was above them. The frequencies coming through the Azure center are too powerful for them to work with. Frequencies coming through the center are associated with the crystal spiral, and the crystal spiral actually moves out through 5 and through the Katara grid, holding connection and distributing energy through the grid. Now, center 5 is an important connection point in its own right also, and it has connection with pentagonal geometry. Pentagonal geometry has natural connection with dimension 5. So they were able to use the pentagonal geometry and its associated golden mean rectangle and employ that dynamic to work with these centers as follows. So when we take the golden mean rectangle and we insert it into the Katara grid as shown by the green rectangle here, it has its golden mean center here. This will be the center for a corresponding golden mean spiral. Now if we further subdivide that golden mean rectangle to get the Fibonacci rectangle shown in yellow here. Now this has a Fibonacci center almost in the center of this structure. In other words, it comes in almost or fairly closely on the spine of the Katara grid. So this Fibonacci center then has natural affinity and has connection alignment with dimension 5. Because it's symmetrical around the center, this whole arrangement can also be applied from the top down within the Katara grid. So when we arrange the center, this is the golden mean and Fibonacci rectangle arrangement, and the upper half of the Katara grid from the top down, we find that the Fibonacci center aligns with center 8, with dimensional center 8. So the connections that are held through center 8 could be brought into alignment with this Fibonacci center. So the combination of the two Fibonacci rectangles, their Fibonacci centers, those two Fibonacci centers then facilitate a connection, a bridging connection between dimensions 8 and 5 divides the center, the Azure center, the powerful Azure center. Now, so what was possible to do then was to bring in influences into the dimensional grid through dimensional center 8, bridge them through this Fibonacci bridging connection from 8 down to 5. So they were able to bring energy that was coded to the strength of dimension 8 and down into dimension 5 and to interact with the spiral that was coming out through dimension 5 also. So hitting the crystal spiral in dimension 5 with this dimension 8 energy, they were able to deflect some of it to ignite a Fibonacci spiral. Now this Fibonacci spiral combined the frequencies of dimension 8 that had been brought in with the dimension 5 frequencies already in the center, the energies that were diverted from the crystal spiral. So these formed, 5 plus 8 combined, formed a D13 frequency, an artificial D13 frequency that was reverse coded. In other words, an artificial combination of the dimensions 8 and 5 to form a reverse coded D13 frequency. So this could be ignited Fibonacci spiral, and this spiral then could be projected out and up through the grid. So this D13 Fibonacci spiral was then projected up the 4, 7, 10 dimensional side of the grid, and it directly hit the central spine of the grid just below dimension 12, where it again intersected with the crystal spiral. Now the dimension 13 frequency had the power to override the D12 connection, so they succeeded in breaking the dimensional connections between 12 and 11 and between 12 and 10 just below dimension 12. So this severed the grid connections from dimension 12 down into 11 and 10. Now, dimension 9 is important in this whole situation because when we were looking at the universal structure with the two Katara grids, so one Katara grid representing the matter fields and another Katara grid representing the light and sound fields, and we saw how these phased together so that the two Katara grids came into a 90-degree alignment. And in that situation, dimension 9 was directly aligned with dimension 15. So dimension 9 is reinforced by this connection with dimension 15. And so this was able to retain the connection, the connection with the higher dimensional levels, and particularly the connection with the dimension 12. Now, these higher dimensional conflicts in dimensions 10 and 11 became known as the wars in the heavens, and the whole interference with the grid structure in our universe became known as the fall of man. Even though, strictly speaking, it isn't the fall of man per se, it's more a fall in dimensional structure itself. In other words, it was the tree itself that fell. And by fall, we simply mean it dropped in frequency. Now, this whole episode is also known as the fall of Lyra, because the physical connections associated with these higher dimensional centers are mostly in the constellation of Lyra. So we have mechanics originating from, masterminded from dimension 11, working through dimension 8 and incorporating dimension 5, creating a harness field to train energies being pulled in through dimension 8, bridging them down to dimension 5, combining them to form an artificial higher frequency D13 reverse current, which was used to trigger and direct a Fibonacci spiral up through the 4, 7, 10 side of the Katara grid. Now, it's interesting to look at the polarities involved. These four centers, 2, 5, 8, and 11, are associated with the Man-A frequency, the Man-A polarity. Centers 1, 4, and 7 are associated with the E-ray polarity, which we've discussed earlier. And centers 3, 6, 9, and 12 are associated with the Manu polarity. So most of the mechanics worked through the Man-A polarity. In other words, it was manic aggression, afflicting the E-ray frequencies and the associated dimensional centers, particularly 4, 7, and 10. With the Manu frequencies, are the neutral frequencies that transcend the polarity between the Man-A and the E-ray frequencies. So these Manu frequencies, 3, 6, 9, and 12, they are the root of salvation. They are the ones that are holding connection and that are holding the possibility for healing this conflict between within these levels in the dimensional structure. This pathway through 3, 6, 9 is also known as the Ark of the Covenant passage. And it's interesting that I think it was Nikola Tesla who said that the mystery of the 3, 6, and the 9 is the path of progress. And that is actually very, very true. So this is a portion of the grid that is holding connection and that is holding the possibility for healing for the remaining problems in the grid. Now, it's important to emphasize that the centers 8 and 5, even though they were involved in this mechanics, that doesn't mean that there are bad centers per se. Like, centers 8 and 5 are very powerful in their own right, and when they exist in balanced relationship with the rest of the grid and the rest of the centers, everything is fine with them. It is where they're isolated and used in an artificial way for a particular purpose. It's a distorted application of the power of these centers. Also, when we talk about manic aggression or Man-A afflicting the E-ray side, we're not talking about men and women here, because as persons, we encompass all of these polarities. We have elements of all of these three polarities in our makeup, regardless of gender. Okay, we may have them in different combinations, and we may use them in different ways, but it's not fundamentally a male-female issue. It's more a dimensional polarity issue. Now we can see how the tree of life emerged from this process. The process effectively eliminated significant connection to dimension 12, so that disappeared from the picture. Now the harness field between dimensional centers 8 and 5 bridged and bypassed the central connection point in the center of the Katara grid, in other words, the Ashray point. So that was no longer significant in the grid. It was effectively bypassed by this harness field. Influence is now coming in through this hidden inner core of Del Sun, corresponding to dimension 8. In other words, that's holding the interconnections into and out of this grid. So that is a key energetic point, even though it's not recognized in a lot of versions of the grid. Corresponding to dimension 8, it's a center that holds interconnection for the grid. And that then feeds down to what was originally dimension 5. So dimension 5 now takes on major significance. The influences are coming in through dimension 5, and so that's a key player in the process. Dimension 5 gets elevated, or it gets exalted now to a central sun within the grid. So it now becomes the center for the grid, and that's reflected in the its position within the flower pattern that backs the grid. This Tiferet center, this central sun, this core central sun center, then becomes the sun around which the remaining centers revolve or orbit as planets. Now, this sun center, this is effectively radiating influence out into the grid to the remaining centers as planetary centers that orbit the central sun. So this is effectively the outer sun for the grid. Now, this center, with its original dimensional 5 coding, holds association with pentagonal geometry. So the exaltation of this center as a central sun center can be a reason why pentagonal geometry and associated golden mean rectangles and so on have been exalted in the realm of sacred geometry. Pentagonal geometry can have been a tool within sacred geometry for accessing and working with this center. And it may have been a motivation for the interest that the Greeks and the mystical groups during the Renaissance period took in all of this. Now, this tree of life pattern is normally shown in association with the flower of life pattern, or the flower of life pattern forms a backdrop for it. This, to a certain extent, it provides a rationale for the structure, because the structure, standing entirely on its own, it's a rationale or an explanation for how that structure arose or what significance it holds. So the flower of life pattern provides background geometry that proportions the grid. So the grid is proportioned on the flower of life pattern, so that determines the spacing, the location and spacing of the centers and their angular alignments. In particular, it associates the center of the flower of life pattern with the Tiferet center in the center of the tree of life grid. So that emphasizes the centrality or the power of this center within the tree of life grid. It's interesting to note that within the revised numbering in the tree of life grid, 6 is assigned to the Tiferet center. Now, the flower of life pattern has a fundamentally hexagonal geometry. The cell patterns underlying the tree of life grid are 6-sided, so they carry the 6 very powerfully. So we have the 6 in the 6 leaves surrounding the 6 center. We have number 6 assigned to the center. We have the center located within the center of a 6-petaled pattern, forming a cell structure, and there are 6 repetitions of that cell immediately around that particular central cell, and then there are further 12 outside that again. So this brings the hexagonal geometry into relationship with the underlying or the inherent pentagonal geometry associated with the Tiferet center and associated with the grid. This process of artificially combining frequencies from dimensions 5 and 8 and running them as a reverse current up through the dimensional structure into the space between dimensions 12 and 11, in other words, creating a clash of spirals in this realm, it obviously had major consequences for creation. It led to a breaking of connections within this realm, particularly between dimensions 12 and 11 and between 12 and 10. So this led to not only a breaking connection but also a fall in frequency. So this was obviously a major event in creation, and it may well correlate with what's described as the Big Bang in the conventional science of creation. In other words, the Big Bang may in fact have been a big crack, representing a crack or fragmentation of dimensional structure. So it led to fragmentation of structure and fragmentation of the forms within creation and of the consciousness and experience of creation within these realms. In other words, the experience of creation became progressively more fragmented. It also led to a closed system. In other words, the portion of dimensional structure within our local universe affected by this event became a closed system. In other words, it was cut off from the life force that was receiving from dimension 12 and through dimension 12 from the higher levels of creation above it. So it was cut off from life force and renewal. Now, when a branch is cut off from a tree, in other words, cut off from its life force, it progressively withers, and the same thing happens with a system that is cut off from its source connections. It progressively withers or decays, and in doing so, it releases a consciousness that is trapped within the system so that it can return to source, albeit in an unconscious way. But at least it is a return. Like the general idea or the general principle is that consciousness doesn't get trapped permanently in degraded forms or in a closed system. Now, this process is reflected in two very major laws of physics, the laws of energy. One of the laws of energy states that the quantity of energy in a closed system remains constant. It just changes from one form to another. But a second law also states that physical processes in such a system evolve in a direction of increasing disorder. In other words, there's a progressive decline in quality, a progressive decline in order, a progressive decline in the usefulness of the energy. So the energy becomes less useful and the system as a whole degrades. So that is the law of entropy. So this describes the process of progressive decline within a closed system like this. In other words, it's the ashes to ashes, dust to dust route of return to source. Now, there have been repeated falls down through the system. Since the original fall, it's referred to as the fall of Lyra, there have been progressive falls at lower levels in creation. In other words, this process has repeated many times down through dimensional structure within this system. And it has led to progressive fragmentation down through all of the different levels in the system. So it has led to fragmentation of consciousness down through the levels, fragmentation of the associated structures, for example, fragmentation of DNA, fragmentation of bodily structures, and so on. And this in turn leads to a progressive degree of unconsciousness within the system. In other words, forms are degrading and the quality of consciousness, conscious experience is declining, and it leads to a degree of unconsciousness, and this in turn leads to what are referred to as shadow influences. Now we can see the impact of this fragmentation in our experiences within creation. If we take our 3D bodies can handle 3D consciousness, and that's our purpose. But we are also conscious in our soul, at soul level in dimensions 4, 5, and 6. So we have soul consciousness at those levels. Now, when we go to sleep, we withdraw our consciousness from our conscious focus from the body, and we move it up into the soul realm. In other words, into dimensions 4, 5, and 6, the astral, the soul level, and so on. We spend our nighttime period in these realms recuperating, and then we come back into our bodies. But when we come back into physical embodiment, we retain very little of our conscious experience in the soul realms. In other words, our bodies are not capable of computing our experiences in the soul realms. And so what we bring back from the soul realms in terms of conscious awareness is quite limited and in some ways quite distorted to fit into the bodily experience, what the body can handle. So we can see the impact there of fragmentation, the fragmentation of the structures, fragmentation of DNA in the body, and the fragmentation of structures generally. It leads to a more disjointed experience of consciousness within these realms. Now, these shadow influences, they do require and are open to healing. So there is the possibility of healing. And what can't be healed needs to be released, to dissolve, to go down to the process of dissolution that frees the consciousness for an unconscious return to source. Now, the whole process also leads to a lack of connection, a loss of flow of resources. In other words, there's the disconnection from the life forces flowing in through dimension 12 from higher levels, from dimension 12 and higher levels. This is no longer available once the connections are broken, leading to a lack of resources. This means that the resources within this system are finite and are subject to progressive degradation. So this leads to competition for finite resources. It leads to wars of conquests. It leads to influences attempting to assert dominion, to take ownership of resources, to take control of resources, take control of land, take control of people, take control of assets, or whatever resource is valuable. So there are certain influences asserting dominion, and in order to assert dominion, they create servitude. So this creates an order of lords, the lords of creation within the system, who rule over these realms, and also creates serfs, what were referred to as serfs in feudal times, effectively servants, and in more extreme forms it creates slavery. And more particularly it creates the attitude of the survival of the fittest. In other words, you have to assert strength in order to survive, and it leads to exploitation of resources and exploitation of people. So this is where our wars of conquest, our wars of dominion, and so on. And the word dominion itself is the Latin for, dominus is the Latin for lord. So dominion is asserting lordship, asserting authority over, claiming authority over, and asserting rulership over resources. It also leads to the perception of a hostile environment. Now, one of the problems, the original problems in creation, in the original break in creation, or that led to the original break in creation, was a distrust of natural order. In other words, there were problems arising with the uncontrolled propagation of aggression and violence, and this was blamed on a flaw in creation itself. Rather than influence themselves taking responsibility, they blamed natural order for the problems that were arising. So there was this distrust of natural order. So this leads to a distrust of nature and a desire to control it, and effectively rearranging creation to meet perceived needs and perceived purposes. Now, humans and other beings in creation, they are legitimate creators within creation, but what they create is very much conditional on the quality of consciousness. So the products of human creation are very conditional on the quality of consciousness. So a lot of human creation can be good, but some of it isn't necessarily beneficial to the greater good. This system from dimension 11 down in this realm, in our local universe, it effectively creates a closed subset of creation. However, it is still contained within a larger creation that is fundamentally open. Creation cannot be completely closed nor self-existent in a closed system, for the fundamentally simple reason that creation would need to exist already in order to create itself. So existence is the fundamental reality, is the fundamental predicate, it's the one thing that cannot be taken out of the picture. We can neither create nor uncreate existence. It exists eternally as absolute aliveness, as pure consciousness, as pure absolute aliveness that transcends all definition or conditioning. And this is what we have touched on earlier. Fundamental relationship between this absolute aliveness or source state and the creation that emerges from it is itself necessarily unconditioned. In other words, source itself is not confined nor limited by factors in creation such as time, location, definition, and so on. It is fundamentally free and fundamentally open. Now, we are spent a lot of our existence in creation within this realm. So we're accustomed to thinking in terms of closed and defined systems. So our challenge now is to also think in terms of openness. Now, what are the consequences of living in an open system? So we have to open our mentality. This is a fundamental paradigm shift. And a lot of the paradoxes that arise in current scientific thought and understanding of creation, they appear to sit on the boundary between closed and open systems. So they are pointing us towards a larger reality. We can take time as an example. In normal 3D consciousness, we perceive time flowing linearly from past through the present into the future, and we perceive creation as an event that happened in the remote past, in other words, at the very edge of time in the remote past. However, as we come into a more open relationship with dimensional structure, our whole relationship with time alters. As we expand into higher levels of consciousness, we experience an expansion of consciousness, an integration of consciousness that has a much wider range of perception, and it can see much further in both time and location. This is like when we're in 3D, it's out in fields and seeing the trees and the grass and the forest and so on. Now, as we go up a mountain, or if we go up in a helicopter, for example, we begin to take progressively more elevated views of the countryside. We begin to see broader vistas of locality, and our visual perception is greatly expanded. Now, as we go higher and higher, progressively higher through all the different levels of expansion and conscious integration, progressively integrate all of time. Now, we come to a certain level when we're at the very high levels of creation, where our consciousness is very free and very open, and it has access to all of time. That is where it merges, it experiences eternity. In other words, where there are no boundaries, time isn't confined to an instant or a particular location within time. So we have much more expanded perception of time, a much more expanded view of time, a much more expanded panorama. We can find the present as that portion of time in which we're consciously aware. As our consciousness expands, our perception of the present continuously expands. Our now expands to embrace all of time and progressively all of creation. Now, our perception is progressively more detached, but it's also more expanded, more integrated, and then progressively encompasses the whole to a greater degree. In this situation, this experience of now, of eternity, encompasses all of creation. The temporal now in 3D perception connects directly to this eternal now, eternal experience of now, and it is the most significant connection in time is in the now. In other words, that's where we're alive, and that's where we connect with aliveness. That's where we connect with the greatness or the totality of creation, and ultimately with eternity. It all happens in the now. In this context, creation is happening in the now. In other words, we are connecting with creation directly through the now, and we're drawing creation into our now. So creation then becomes much more meaningful in terms of our present. And this fundamentally alters our relationship with creation. So instead of seeing a horizontal passage of time like clips in a film, instead of seeing the flashing past on the screen, we're perceiving the totality of creation. And so we're effectively beginning to operate in the vertical dimension in addition to the horizontal dimension. So we transcend the limitations of horizontal perception, and we progressively expand into a much more integrated perception in the vertical direction that becomes progressively expanded and progressively connects with eternity and infinity. That fundamentally alters our relationship with creation. Creation then is something that's happening right now. We're part of the process. It's something that's coming through us. It's something that we have direct connection with. It's something that's very real for us, and something that we have that's significant, and we have a role to play in it. This is the context in which we become part of creation. We become creators within creation. Now, in all of this, while all this is going on, Dimension 12 is still intact and still encompasses all of creation within our local universe. It's still fully intact, and so it didn't disconnect from what was happening below it. It remained open and available. It was the consciousness within the lower levels that chose to disconnect from Dimension 12 and created the consequences in the lower dimensional levels. So this D12 level is fundamentally available, and it's unaltered by what has happened below it. In other words, this carries the original divine blueprint. This level in creation is often referred to as the Christos, the Christ, or the Buddhic. It's best understood as a state of consciousness. Now, we tend to associate things like the Christ, the Christos, and so on, or even Buddha, with particular personalities such as Jesus Christ, or Krishna, or Gautama Buddha, and so on, and other famous personages who embody this consciousness in 3D. Personalization of consciousness is very prevalent in 3D because that's how we operate at a very personal level in consciousness. Consciousness at this level has very much transcended personality. It's much more expanded consciousness that embraces a much wider range of connection. It's not confined to individual personalities. It embraces whole families of consciousness. This level in creation is fundamentally open. It's fundamentally connected, and it has full resource flows, and it's fully available. So this holds open connection to everything above, to the primal light fields, primal sound fields, and to source, direct source connection. So this is the salvation, as it were. So it retains original primal order and intent in creation. In other words, the original divine intent is preserved intact at this level. It's not corrupted by what has happened below it. This provides then the possibility to heal what has happened below. Now, fortunately, connection was retained from Dimension 12 through Dimension 9 and down this side of the dimensional structure, down through Dimensions 9, 6, and 3. This allowed for higher dimensional influences in the primal light fields and primal sound fields and the Christos frequencies in Dimension 12. These allowed for these to be present, to remain present in creation, to remain available to creation. So this provides the opportunity for salvation, the opportunity for healing, the opportunity for recovery, the opportunity for healing what can be healed. This can be used to heal problems and to reset natural order. It's fully available. And it's like a PC. Once a PC becomes infected by a virus, we normally reset the PC to a prior healthy state to restore the order within the computer. So here we have the opportunity to do a reset, to reconnect with original intent in creation, original design, and to use this to reset the problems that have arisen further down the line. So this holds the potential for salvation, for recovery, for healing, and for reintegration back to source. In other words, it holds open the possibility for a conscious return to connection with the higher levels in creation and connection to source. The alternative is to allow this system to burn itself out, and which it will burn itself out over time. And what cannot heal by process of rising in frequency, what's often referred to as a process of ascension. Ascension is simply raising a frequency. What cannot go up that route, the forms that contain the consciousness that cannot make that journey progressively dissolve, and they release the consciousness in unconscious states, and the consciousness returns through an unconscious route, but it does return to source. In other words, it's not trapped permanently within an isolated system. So we exist as microcosms within this. We have access to the natural order in creation and its Christic connections on one side, and we have our shadow influences and all the problems that have accumulated over our history within this realm. So we carry both sides. It's not that we're fully on one side or the other. We may come into creation on the Christic side, but we take on the burdens of the shadow influences within a closed side of creation. This leaves us with a hyper creation, and we as microcosms within creation, microcosms of creation within creation, reflect this. So we have soul and spirit connections on one side and shadow influences on the other, and we're moving between the two extremes, attempting to heal what can be healed, and if necessary releasing what needs to be released. We can spend some of our time like we're on the sunny side and things are looking good, and on the other times the storm clouds come over, the storms rise, and things can be quite rough for us. But we have the capacity to move between the two and to use the benefits of the spirit connections on the side of this structure to heal what can be healed in the closed side. Now, there are differences between these two sides, somewhat akin to the differences between democracy and autocracy. On this side, there is less separation, more direct connection with higher families of consciousness in higher dimensional levels, and ultimately more direct connection with source. Also, there's more direct access to resources. So there's less dependence, and there's much more impersonal empowerment that leads to freedom. And that compares with the autocracy within this closed system, arising from dominion and lordship. Now, there are three broad influences in play here. There are influences that are progressing towards freedom. There are influences that desire to progress towards freedom. And then there are influences that still desire to maintain dominion, to preserve the order of things that they have become accustomed to. The influences that desire dominion resent interference from Dimension 12 and from the higher levels. So there's certain hostility in certain influences towards Dimension 12 and Christos influences. A lot of creation has happened to us since the original split in creation, since the original fall in creation, since the fall of Lyra. There is still creative capacity within the system, and it creates, but only within the confines of the system. And the quality of creation progressively degrades. But critical issue is within this realm is that beings that are being created, forms that are being created within this level, are missing the D12 connection. And that is of critical importance. They're fundamentally missing this connection, and they desire and need to restore this connection, because that allows them then open access to the higher levels in creation. This D12 level in creation, the Christos level, which carries the original pure intent in creation, it's also referred to as the Maharic level in creation. The term Maharata encompasses the sound tones and fundamental frequencies of these three-dimensional levels. So this Maharic level has tremendous healing capacity within this system, and because it has the power to override the lower level, lower dimensional influences within this realm, and to bring healing and resolution. So this is the force of salvation and of solution and recovery within this framework. But there are certain influences that want to deny that impact. In other words, they want to maintain things the way they are. There's a certain hostility towards the Christic and the Maharic influences, and a desire to deprecate them. Now, since this fall in creation and the subsequent preservation of D12 connection and preserving this connection down through portions of the grids, this has created a program to make the D12 frequencies and resources available through all levels in this particular part of creation. This program is often referred to as the Christos Realignment Mission. So it's an attempt to make these resources as widely available as possible to the portions of creation that need the assistance and that can benefit from it and that actually wants the assistance. This realignment mission has been ongoing for a very long period of our history, effectively almost since the beginning of this fall problem. It's ongoing, and this Christos level, this D12 level, is beyond fall. It doesn't know fall or failure. In other words, that is there and will remain there. It doesn't fail. Failure doesn't arise at that level. Failure in relation to this program arises when we lose connection or when we lose focus with the potential of what's possible through this access. The availability of this connection through D12 and the ongoing connection then through the higher levels in creation, that creates, as we've said, a hybrid universe where we have this fallen energy in creation, and then we have this free and connected dimensional levels in creation. And the boundary between them is flexible. In other words, this opens the closed system. It creates an open boundary, or a progressively more open boundary, that allows for the possibility of healing to come in and progression, evolution of consciousness, for consciousness to evolve past these issues and to move back towards their original connections and back to their higher families of consciousness and their source connection. Now, it's important to remember that the consciousness that fell during this instant, that is family consciousness at the D12 level, that is available to assist in any way possible. But it doesn't force itself on the situation. If the help is refused or isn't desired, then the opportunity is lost. And the consciousness then is on a path of progression towards increasing unconsciousness and return to source through that path. The ashes to ashes, dust to dust, return to source. While sometimes life here is sometimes referred to as life on the prison planet, in fact, the doors in the hybrid situation that we have, the doors of the prison are effectively open. The opportunities are there, and it's up to us to choose whether we want to avail of what's available to us or not. Now, there are a few significant points to be made in relation to the connections within these dimensional grid structures. Energy flows as vortices into and out through these structures, and these have a structure as indicated here. So we have an inner vortex into which energy flows to that particular node, and we have an external cone, an outer cone, through which the energy flows outwards into expression. So this is the natural structure for these vortex energy flows. Within this structure, the inner and outer flows are aligned and balanced. And this allows for frictionless flow through the levels of these grid structures. Now, these flows arise through all of the nodes, all of the centers within the Katara grid. And for example, within our bodily structure, we have equivalent energy structures associated with the chakras, for example, and they carry this structure. They have an inflow cone and an outflow cone, which are balanced in the center. Now, the most significant points of connection are through the core of the Katara grid. This is where the Katara grid emerges from, and through which it returns and through which it holds connection to core creation and to the higher levels of creation leading directly to source. There's also a significant connection point at dimension 12, as we've indicated before. This holds connection to higher levels in creation, higher dimensional levels, such as the primal light fields and the primal sound fields. And it also holds connection to the core of higher levels in universal and cosmic structure, such as the Eka and Akasha levels of universal structure. Now, when we come to the Tree of Life grid situation, is a bit different. First of all, the connections at dimension 12 are broken, so there's no connection up to the higher levels in creation. This means it isn't possible to ascend vertically within this structure. Secondly, this is a framework that draws a distinction between inflows and outflows, between internal creation and external creation. Creation comes in at the level of dimension 8 through the data center, and the outflows take place through dimension 5 through what's called the Tiferet center, the central sun center within this grid structure. And the two are linked by this connection, this bridging connection between dimension 8 and dimension 5. Now, this particular arrangement differs from the more natural arrangements between the Katara grid structure, and it isn't quite as frictionless or natural as the aligned cones and the balanced energy flows that arise within the more natural Katara grid framework. Inner and outer realities exist as polarities in relation to each other, and problems arise in inner reality just as much as they do in the outer reality. So in relation to how we experience these realities, we can summarize the relationships briefly as follows. Within our inner reality, in other words, what is looking out into the world, our functional consciousness is focused in terms of ego. In other words, that is the functional consciousness that is looking out into the world and that is interacting directly with the world. There are two levels of influence feeding into this. We have higher dimensional connections and influences coming down through the soul level and holding connection through the soul level up to higher levels, still higher levels within dimensional structure and within creation, going from soul to spirit to Christos and to primal light and sound fields and to the direct source connection. These can be regarded as the super conscious influences that impact on our experience in creation and that feed into our egoic consciousness. On the other side of the equation then we have shadow influences. These are the broken energies, the distortions and the problems that often arise from past experience, past involvement in creation. These issues may not necessarily be our own, may be arising within our larger spirit and soul families that are in our racial connections. But they are something that we've taken responsibility for, assisting in healing. And it's very important that we're aware of these shadow influences and that we deal with them. Now, if we try to ignore these shadow influences and try to dismiss them, they will project into our outer experience, outer world, into our outer experience in interaction with creation. And they will manifest and arise as something that we need to address in the outer world. They will often manifest as a teacher, attempting to direct our attention to the issues that we have undertaken to heal. And they can often be quite a tough teacher. They can become our teacher in the external world, often a tough teacher, but sometimes a necessary teacher. Now, as we engage healing and resolve the issues that we need to resolve within ourselves, we strengthen our higher dimensional connections and we empower higher level connections into our functional consciousness. Now, this entails an expansion of influence. In other words, our sphere of influence in the world increases. This increase in influence entails responsibility. We have greater empowerment and greater influence. Now, if we fail to use this power and influence responsibly, we will create consequences that will feed back and cause a reduction in the power that we have available to us. So the whole process of healing and of expansion and integration of consciousness goes hand in glove with responsibility. In other words, we shouldn't engage a level of empowerment that we cannot handle responsibly. If we do, there is the potential for abuse and consequences and for negative consequences that we will have to deal with in the future. Inner and outer realities mirror each other and there's a high degree of interaction between them. Influences that arise within our internal shadow, in other words, the shadow issues that we have undertaken to heal, will often reflect in outer conditions. And likewise, outer conditions will often reflect inner issues that we need to address. So the two are highly interactive. Sometimes issues are most easily dealt with by addressing the outer circumstances associated with them. In other cases, it's easier to sort out the internal issues within ourselves, in other words, to engage the healing that we need to do within ourselves. And that's often an easier way to sort out issues. Internal and external creation are both important. External reality, or outer reality, provides a workbench or laboratory where we can try things out, see how they work out in practice, and learn from the process. If it wasn't important, we wouldn't have come here to begin with. So it's really a question of finding an appropriate balance between our inner and outer realities and how they interact for us, and adjusting that balance, to make the most rapid progress. Now, for an interesting point of background detail, there was a sacred symbol held in great reverence by the ancient Greeks, particularly by the Pythagoreans. This was referred to as a tetractys. It's basically a triangular arrangement of 10 numbers illustrated like this. Now, similar to the Tree of Life, it has 9 elements on the outside surrounding a central sun element at the core. Looking back at the Tree of Life grid, basic Tree of Life grid has 10 centers. The additional Death center only appears in special versions of the Tree of Life. And here we have the central sun center with 9 planets surrounding it. So it has very interesting association with the Tree of Life grid. So it highlights the significance of 9. Now 9 is associated with number of bodies in the solar system, also obviously with the Enneagram, with Sri Yantra, the number of triangles within the famous Sri Yantra symbol, and Kundalini is often regarded as spanning 9 dimensions, dimensions 1 to 9. Now if we added a 5th layer to this particular sacred symbol, we get an altogether more interesting arrangement. This is a triangular arrangement, obviously with 15 numbers, and here we have 12 outer elements surrounding 3 inner core elements. The 12 outer elements can be regarded as associated with the 12 dimensions of the matter fields, and the 3 inner core dimensions being associated with the primal light fields. So this gives us the full spectrum of 15 dimensions within dimensional structure. So it's a more complete representation of dimensional structure. This illustrates the power of 5. Notice when we include the 5th density level corresponding to the primal light fields, that brings a lot more power to the 12 dimensions of the matter fields. When we combine the two, the primal light fields and the 12-dimensional matter fields, we get a more complete representation of dimensional structure and a more powerful configuration. In our hybrid creation, we have the two extremes. On the one side, we have more open and direct connection with higher dimensional levels and all the capability that provides. At the other extreme, we have more limited connection, degrees of fragmentation, and shadow influence. And we have a spectrum that stretches between the two. Now, we're constantly cycling from one end of that scale to the other. In other words, we're using our soul, spirit, and higher level connections to help heal the fragmented parts of our being. In other words, the shadow influences that we are taking responsibility for. So there is a spectrum that we cycle across routinely. Now, as we heal, as we use the resources that we have access to help heal what can be healed, we progressively ratchet our way up the frequency scale. And this is often referred to as a process of ascension. We have our personal cycles, but we also have larger cycles. We say racial cycles, we have planetary cycles, and we have the various ages of humanity. In other words, there are times when we have more direct access to the more open and connected side of creation. The Christic side is direct connection to Christic and higher level influences. Other times humanity is deeply immersed in the shadow influences. Now these ages, these cycles between the two extremes, are often referred to in the ancient Indian traditions as the yugas, the ages of human growth and development. In the past, speaking earlier at the very beginning about ancient science and ancient technology, it would appear that in prehistoric times there was much more open access to the higher levels in creation, to the higher dimensional levels and this particular side of creation. There are indications that some of our prehistoric civilizations had more open connection to higher dimensional influences and to the capabilities they offer. When we talk about prehistoric civilizations, we're talking about civilizations that go back beyond our present conventional recorded history, that go back quite a distance in time. Some of these had great achievements in terms of construction of massive structures and achieving relatively high levels of civilization with much less need for the type of 3D technologies that we currently rely so much on. For example, who needs wheels or rollers to move large blocks of stone, where there's freer access to capabilities like levitation? Who needs fire when there's access to interdimensional energies? Who needs writing when it's possible to encode information directly into substances like crystal and to read it directly back from that? Who needs communication devices when there is more open access to telepathy, for example? Now, the major caution around these capabilities. There was significant abuse of these powers in earlier times, and this led to significant destruction, degradation of the planet, and necessitating the withdrawal of these connections and of these capabilities. So civilizations collapsed, humanity sank back into a very primitive state, had to begin the long process of the climb back to some sort of civilized life on the planet, rebuild the structures that support civilization, and to create a more useful existence for themselves on the planet. So humanity has had to build its way back up through a series of dark ages to get back to where we presently are. Now, if we aspire to move further into acquiring such capabilities, we need to earn these back. We need to display responsibility, wisdom, and spiritual maturity. We can handle them much more capably than they have been handled in the past. Now, if we take the example of free energy, There's a lot of talk of free energy, zero-point energy, and so on. Now, free energy basically is interdimensional energy. It's drawing energies from higher dimensional levels into 3D and making it available within 3D. Now, any such energies need to flow in a loop with a safe return. For example, electric current flows, it needs to flow from its source through the load and back to the source. In other words, there must be a complete circuit back to where it came from. So these energies need to flow in loops with safe return. In other words, it's very important when higher dimensional energies are brought into 3D that are not trapped here. In other words, that's not good for either 3D nor for the energies themselves. It's very important that things don't get trapped here in 3D. So what comes in must be able to flow back out again, flow back out freely and safely and openly. This is the essence of renewability. So there's a need for a wider understanding of the processes involved with some of these energies and a prudence in applying them. And these are the critical limitations on possibilities, on achieving these possibilities and on the pace for progress. There's great potential. We do have the potential to expand into these areas. And there's also a great need for new developments to mitigate pressing problems. For example, we've reached a level of civilization now in our 3D domain where we're running into significant problems. We're running into problems with resources. We're running into problems with the use of these resources and the problems they cause, environmental problems, and so on. And we're struggling for solutions. We do need to expand into a much bigger view of creation, access more powerful solutions to the problems we currently face. So there is significant potential for progress. For example, as humanity develops, we ratchet our way up the frequency scale. In other words, we use what connection we have to higher dimensional levels to help heal the issues, the fragmentation and the shadow issues that we were responsible for. And we gradually ratchet our way up to the dimensional scale. Now, humanity as a whole is progressing out of 3D into the soul world. We do have access to Dimension 4 to some degree, but we're beginning to open access now to Dimension 5. We're coming into more direct contact with the soul worlds, and this is the fifth world that's often talked about in some of the ancient traditions. So we are coming into more open access with Dimension 5 and the capabilities that offers. D5 is a center point in the soul worlds, and this represents an expanded state of consciousness. In other words, it's a bigger consciousness than personal consciousness. In other words, it's a family consciousness, a soul family consciousness. It's a more expanded and more integrated consciousness than we experience in 3D. So in a sense, it's going beyond personality and personalization into an expanded view. The soul consciousness deals more with principles and archetypes and the big picture of things. So we are moving into this realm, this expanding consciousness beyond a purely personal focus within 3D. So in this context, it is very relevant for us to be looking at Dimension 5 and the connections associated with Dimension 5. For example, we've mentioned previously that certain pentagonal geometries and so on do have connection with D5s, and it is relevant to look at those connections and to explore them. Now, the Dimension 5 is a very powerful frequency and a very powerful realm, and it says it's most powerful when it's held in balanced relationship with the larger framework that contains it. In other words, that it's not treated in isolation, limited framework. That it's looked at or engaged in terms of balanced relationships with the larger framework that contains it. In other words, the full scope of dimensional structure. So in this context, it is meaningful for us to explore issues and aspects associated with Dimension 5. Now, the issues around Dimension 5, less geometric and have more to do with history and politics, and there is very significant history and politics associated with that, as we have briefly outlined. So these issues are coming back into focus for us now, and it's meaningful for us to explore them. Also, there's great need for and great potential for healing around issues in this realm. This is a very great opportunity for us. Now, knowledge is wonderful. It's very empowering, it's liberating, it's exciting, and it's very evolutionary. But knowledge on its own is not enough. We need to integrate it and live it. We need to apply it and embody it in practice. In other words, we need to ground it. And this is an ongoing requirement to ground the knowledge that we have. It's not enough to allow knowledge to reside in ethereal realms. in the realms of theory. We do have to integrate it and ground it and apply it in practice. And that's where the real value of knowledge is derived. So spiritual growth and maturity are an important part. They are key to this. Growth in terms of our relationship with the world that we live in. Growth in terms of having a good, effective relationship with our world, and also good internal relationship with our own higher levels of being, our higher levels of spiritual identity. In other words, to grow in spiritual maturity. Now, life is fundamentally about life, our own life that we've embodied in a body as a personality, and also about the life, its relation to the great source of all life, to the universal life field that underlies all of life, all of creation. This universal life field we commonly call source. This brings us back to the fundamental relationship between our own personalized, individuated life and that relationship with source. We have this very powerful connection to source as the fountain of life within creation generally, but more particularly the fountain of life within our own lives. Now, this is a relationship that's shared with others, with all of our brothers and sisters in creation. All ultimately came from source, all ultimately will return to source, and there are various degrees of connection from where people are at now to source. But there is a connection there. So in essence, there is some form of connection of all life to source. We all share this connection to source, and in that we share connection with each other. So there is a common foundation that's linking all expressions of life. So we do have brother and sister relationships with our fellow human beings. We do have affinity relationships with other forms of life, in other words, with animal life, with plant life, even the life of our planet, the life of our solar systems, and so on. So there is this underlying oneness that integrates all of life and all expressions of life within creation. This encourages a level of respect for life, respect for our own life, and respect for all other expressions of life, for the sanctity of life, and for the tremendous capacity it holds and its potential. Ultimately, all does connect to source, and ultimately, all is equal in source. There is no differentiation in source. Source is undivided, and it doesn't differentiate between different life forms. So there is a level of equality in source, a fundamental level of equality. This is a realm where we leave all ideas of superiority and inferiority behind. In other words, the highest form of superiority is equality. Now, when we look at frequency, we can exalt high frequency and have our appreciation of the lower frequency levels. But when we stand back sufficiently from them, there is a fundamental equality between them. If we take the keyboard of a piano, for example, it isn't the case that the low frequency notes are less valuable than the high frequency notes. They all have their value, and they all have their value in relationship to each other. They all play a part in the great symphony of life. So low frequency isn't inferior per se. It has a different function, a different role in creation, but that role is of value similar to the high frequency levels. So we need to value all levels of frequency and the potential they offer, the functionality that they provide within creation. Principal values are important in how we orient and direct our lives, how we manage our relationships with the world, how we manage our internal relationships with self, with our higher spirit families, and ultimately with divinity and source. Now, we have summarized a number of principles here. These will mean different things to different people. We will each have our own priorities, and we will formulate them as appropriate to our circumstances, and we will have different outlooks on a lot of these issues. Just taking a few fundamental themes here and providing a outline on them. We've already touched on source as a unifying principle underlying all of creation. Empowerment is a very important quality within creation, how we manage power, how we manage our own power, and we don't give our power away easily, that we use our power wisely, and well. Those holding strong source connection have access to resources, in fact all the resources they could possibly need. They don't need our power, they don't need our adulation, they don't need our worship, they don't need offerings, they don't need sacrifices. They don't need or want or ask for any of these. In connecting with higher dimensional influences, it's important that we have a relationship that's based on fundamental respect both ways. In other words, that we don't tolerate being talked down too easily, and we don't talk down to others either. That there is a fundamental respect going both ways, and that there is quality of value in relationships up the line. How we manage our power is important. Empowerment is very closely related to the topics of responsibility and healing. Responsibility entails taking responsibility for consequences arising in our involvement in the world, in our daily lives, and taking responsibility for our own healing. We all have significant healing work to do. We all have fragmented energies, and we also have shadow influences that we have undertaken to heal, which we're taking responsibility for them for whatever reason. So there's a lot of healing work to be done. When we take responsibility and engage this work, we actually do make a lot of progress in dealing with what needs to be dealt with. So it's important that we try as far as possible to avoid blame games, to try and avoid projecting our shadow and our ills and problems and so on to other agencies, projecting them onto government or blaming others for the issues in our lives. Taking responsibility for what we can take responsibility for is the most powerful way of fixing things, the fastest means of growing up. Taking responsibility for our healing is a very powerful way of moving things forward. Now, as we engage healing, it's a lifetime's work, and this involves a lot of hard work and a lot of facing hard situations. And oftentimes there are no magical solutions. We can get help, but there are no magic wands that can be waved to make problems disappear. So it's doing this work that really makes a difference, that really moves things forward in a practical way. As we engage this healing work and taking progressively more responsibility for our lives and our involvement with the world, this leads to empowerment. In other words, we recover our power expands, our capacity to influence the world, our sphere of influence in the world expands. Now, if we abuse that power, it contracts further and creates further problems and leads to a contraction. But if we use it wisely and well, it's a tremendous value in the world. This is what the world needs. Now, love is a very important principle. It's a very important reality in creation. It effectively is the essence of Source that embraces all and eventually draws all home. This is the most powerful expression of our connection to Source. It's like the force of gravity in creation. This is what is drawing us all back to Source, and in doing so, drawing us closer to each other. This is an extremely valuable force in creation. Now, love can express in many ways, like we have the what we normally call love, what's often referred to as soft love, but we also have other forms of love, such as tough love. Now, tough love is the love that a parent, we say, has for a child, a love that upholds order and that enforces the discipline that's necessary to uphold order. Tough love is appropriate in certain circumstances, and it's really a question of balancing the two in the most appropriate way to deal with particular situations. Now, grounding is very important quality also. Being present to our bodies and being present and effective in life. In other words, being very grounded in life and being actively engaged in our lives and being very useful in the world. It's all very well to sit in a cloud and to be very interior in our relationships with the world, but what really matters and where progress is made most rapidly is where we actually engage with the realities of life and we ground effectively in our lives and make the impact in changing things in our lives that make a difference. Grounding is an important quality. Effectively respecting the reality we find ourselves in and respecting the value it offers to us in sorting out issues that we need to address. We came in here for a reason, and it's getting on with facing the issues that we need to address here. That's where we make huge progress. Balance is important, and balancing polarities. Like, we're in a situation, in an environment where polarities are very prevalent. We have all sorts of polarities. We say idealism versus realism, inner versus outer, the generalized polarities. But we also have a lot of polarities in terms of conflict, in terms of difficult situations, in terms of intractable or very difficult, awkward situations that we have to try and navigate our way through. We can recognize that all polarities exist as part of a trinity, and above the polarities there is a third state, a neutral state, that balances the extremity of the polarities and is capable of drawing the two extremes together into a healing space, which offers a high degree of potential for resolution. This neutral state has been referred to as the Manu state, and this is an extremely powerful state. It has the quality of love, and love is very present in this state, and love is a very powerful transformative and healing energy within that state that holds potential for resolving a lot of issues. Discernment is important, not being naive, recognizing and dealing with problems and issues. In other words, facing up to problems in a realistic way, not avoiding problems, and being streetwise, not being easily led astray, not being unduly trusting in situations where we may be exploited. By our engagement with life, our engagement in the world, we learn a lot about life, and we accumulate this knowledge, and we apply it to work our way through situations in ways that avoid exploitation, in ways that avoid being abused. Now, there are many principles and values, and we spend a lot of time in discussing them, but we are constrained by time. People will work out their own relationship with all of these issues. Some of them will be particularly important, and others won't be. It will vary from situation to situation. There's so much more to all of this, but there are limits to time that we need to respect. Now, there can be many differing perspectives on all of this, and I'm sure there'll be many opportunities for people to explore various perspectives. Now, I commend your fortitude for getting to this point, and I thank you for your attention. I also wish to thank all higher level influences that support our efforts down here, and we do get a lot of support, and we do need support. I also wish to thank all who have worked to preserve and develop knowledge down the ages. We're at the end of a long chain of people who have worked to preserve knowledge on the planet at this 3D level. I particularly wish to acknowledge and again thank Yeshe Ashiana, Ace and Michael Dean, and Marianne Calloway and their supporting teams for all their very valuable work in preserving knowledge, bringing knowledge into these times and preserving knowledge in these times. And also thank all who work in support of human evolution. I would like also to honour younger generations who are coming up now and take up the running to move things forward. I wish progress for all in our journeys of exploration, and may we come again into a time and a space where science is once again sacred. Thank you.